Hari Hari. So we're on verse 16. We will do a number of verses today. 16, 17, 18, and 19 of chapter 1, of course. Sanjaya relays what's happening on the battlefield, and he describes King Yudhishthir, the son of Kunti, blew his conch shell, the Ananta Vijaya, and Nakul and Sahadev blew the Sughosha and Manipushpaka. That great archer, the king of Kashi, the great fighter, Shikhandi, Drishtadyumna, Virata, the unconquerable Satyaki, Drupada, the sons of Draupadi, and others, O king, such as the mighty-armed son of Subhadra, all blew their respective conch shells. Text 19. The blowing of these different conch shells became uproarious, vibrating both in the sky and on the earth. It shattered the hearts of the sons of Dhritarashtra. The battle of Kuruksetra is not a battle or a war between Duryodhana, the Kauravas on the one hand, and Arjuna or the Pandavas on the other. That's not what is happening here. Of course, that is obviously what's happening. But what we can see and understand from these events is that it's actually seeing how one group of individuals deal with an existential crisis and how another group of individuals deal with the same existential crisis. Both of these groups of individuals are going to clash on the battlefield, and only one of these groups will remain. This is a fight to the death. What we see here, what we can learn and understand, is how each group of individuals deal with this existential crisis. When the Kauravas hear the sounding of the Pandavas' conch shell, Arjuna's conch shells, Krishna's conch shell, and the rest of the Pandavas, their hearts are shattered. They are overcome by fear and desperation. There is no description of the Pandavas similarly becoming disturbed and fearful when Bhishma and the others on the Kaurava side blew their conch shells. There is no description of that. So Duryodhana and the Kauravas are experiencing great fear. Their hearts are being shattered just by hearing the reverberations of the conch shells of the Pandavas, whereas the Pandavas experience no such disturbance, no such fear. The reason this is so is because Duryodhana and company are focused entirely on what is temporary. All of their life, their entire being, their entire consciousness has only been focused on the manifestations of Triguna in terms of wealth, in terms of prestige, in terms of all these material, fallible, and temporary objects of the senses and the mind. And because their lives have been completely focused on what is temporary, when they are faced with an existential crisis that may bring an end to what they have given their lives to, they experience great disturbance, great fear. Their hearts are shattered. Whereas Arjuna, the Pandavas, place their consciousness in what is eternal, their relationship with the Supreme. So when they are faced with a seemingly existential crisis, they are not bewildered, because what may come to an end is not their relationship with the eternal. So this battle is not about Duryodhana against the Pandavas, the Kauravas against Arjuna, and so on. It is showing how each type of person deals with the trials, the tribulations, and the existential crises that are inevitable in our life. If our life has been solely or primarily focused on that which is temporary, then when we come up against crises, when we come up against difficulties, our hearts are going to be shattered. Whereas, if our consciousness is connected to the Supreme, is connected to Krishna, is focused on that which is eternal and lives through the manifestation of those things which are eternal, our relationship with the Supreme, then when we are faced with crises, we do not lose our sense of self. We are not overcome with fear. Our hearts, our world is not shattered by such circumstances. The opposite of fear is love. When we experience fear, there are hormones that are released in our body: adrenaline, cortisol. These hormones precipitate our inclination towards a fight or flight response. The blood vessels constrict, forcing all the blood and oxygen to those limbs which are going to enable us to fight or flight, run away. Only the most essential needs of the body are met. The most fundamental, the most visceral aspects, organs of the body are being fed oxygen and blood. Everything else is shut down. This is what fear does. The opposite of that is love. The Kauravas, Duryodhana, experienced fear, adrenaline, cortisol. So their experience of reality is narrowly focused. They do not see true, complete, total, and expanded reality, the spiritual reality in which they also exist, a part of which they also are connected, being spirit beings. On the other hand, we have Arjuna, whose consciousness is based on a connection with the Supreme, which is eternal. What does he experience? Love. It is a relationship of trust, of openness. There is a bond, a loving bond, a loving connection with the Supreme. The hormones released are just the opposite: serotonin, oxytocin. These are the hormones released by the body in such a loving environment, in a situation, a relationship of love. The same existential situation, the same crises, two different experiences, two different manifestations. Now, this does not mean that the person who is operating from a place of love or spiritual consciousness is not prepared for the various challenges of life. Quite the opposite. Just as a person who operates from fear, their awareness is actually narrow. The more fearful we are, the more narrow our focus. The more loving we are, the more broad we are able to be aware. spiritually and otherwise. So we see these two manifestations of fear and of love. When operating from a place of love, our awareness is broadened. When operating from a place of love, our ability to understand, our ability to seek, our ability to be open to, our ability to trust is increased. So our existence, our ability to live, to go through life, is greatly improved because our awareness is broadened. Our consciousness is broadened. Our ability to reason and to think is greatly enhanced. Whereas operating from a place of fear, everything is narrow in scope. Only the very minimal of intellectual capacity remains available to us when we're dealing with something that is extraordinarily, or which we feel to be extraordinarily fearful. And it is not that the Pandavas were this type of love is not the love that we see or experience when watching the Hollywood movies. No. Where there's a kind of ignorance and the head in the sand. There is nothing more clear-headed than a loving relationship with the Supreme. When there's that loving bond, that loving connection. Krishna describes it repeatedly, as I mentioned, as the sun that lights up everything in the daytime. There is a clarity, there is an awareness, there is a broad-mindedness, there is a perspective that cannot be achieved when we are focused on that which is temporary, when we are focused on the objects of the senses, born of triguna, material nature. We cannot live in that perspective because we are constricted by fear, a consciousness of fear. We see throughout the Mahabharata, Arjuna prepared as much as, even more so, even than the Kauravas, for what was to come. The story goes he even went to heaven and was taught by the demigods how to use various divine weapons. He went to Lord Shiva, worshiped Lord Shiva, and got the benediction of Shiva's own weapon. So it is not that Arjuna hid his head and buried his consciousness in the sand to get away from reality. Quite the contrary. When we are connected with Krishna, Didami Buddhi Yogam Tam, I give the understanding, any understanding that we need. Yeya Tamam Prabhadhyante is all surrender unto me, I reward them accordingly. Krishna tells Arjuna, my dear Arjuna, declare it boldly that my devotee, those in relationship with me, never perish. Because Krishna is holding the reins of our chariot. And when there's that genuine relationship with Krishna, and having that genuine relationship with Krishna, it's not difficult. It requires practice. It requires dedication. It requires intention. But it is not difficult. It simply requires intentional, deliberate, and continual choice. A genuine, personal relationship with Krishna is possible for everyone, but it must be chosen, it must be intentional, and it must be deliberate. And with Krishna holding the reins of our chariot, of our existence, There's a trust. There's an openness. There's a faith. That is manifest, that exists. This is love. And when we go through life with that guidance of Krishna, with that understanding, with the certainty based on our genuine relationship with Krishna, we do not operate from a platform of fear. We do not operate from a platform of material, temporary objects. Because everything in our life has now become, in its connection with Krishna, because of our bond, because of our relationship with Krishna, everything about us is now on the Parabrahman level. It is now spiritualized. Our relationships are now eternal. When we add Krishna to our life, our relationships become eternal. The story of Dhruva Maharaj, when he went back to Vaikuntha, he turned to the Vishnu Dutas. He says, my dear Vishnu Dutas, I cannot go back to Vaikuntha without my mom, without my mother. And they pointed, look, there she is. She's already ahead of you. When we add Krishna to our existence, when we add Krishna to our lives, everything about us operates now on the eternal platform, on the eternal realm. There is nothing to fear. But there must be that genuine relationship. And that relationship development, it is not difficult. It requires intention. It must be deliberate. Yes. And it must be chosen. In the beginning, yes, it will be faith. Because Krishna does not ring our doorbell and walk into our room. So the beginning of that relationship is right here, right now, discussing Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna, the very last instruction in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, one who recites or understands this conversation of ours worships me by their intelligence. One who shares this conversation of mine is the most dear devotee of mine. One who offers me with love, a leaf, a flower, fruit, or water, I will accept it. And those individuals will be in relation with me. And they will eventually become one with me in relationship, in consciousness, not an identity. There is always unique identity. Relationships requires unique individuality. But there is oneness of consciousness. So we must choose a relationship with Krishna, and then we can live a life based on love, manifesting love, which is eternal. Because Krishna, Parabrahman, is eternal. Hari Hari.